and yeah, thank you all for being here. Really wonderful to see people calling in from all over the US and indeed all over the world. So thank you. I guess these sort of well, this isn't, I wish I was doing this in person in many ways. It's obviously great to be able to have participation from people who otherwise wouldn't be able to join us in Boulder. So thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Does that look good? You see a PowerPoint slide? Awesome. Okay. Well, so thank you again to the Boulder Ultra Protein Project. And if I see there are lots of students calling in here from University of Colorado Boulder, and if you're interested in this space from any disciplinary background, then I would encourage you to reach out and see whether there's an involvement space for you in the Boulder Ultra Protein Project. It seems like they're doing really good work and all student-led. So thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about this paper, which is about to be published, and I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking my co-author Dan Blaustein-Vito, who's a researcher at the Breakthrough Institute and heads their food and agricultural division there. I guess let's jump into it. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be very happy to take questions, comments, and talk about anything that comes up. So just very briefly, by way of background and context, animal agriculture presents major sustainability challenges, livestock production being associated with high environmental externalities, including higher greenhouse gas emissions and land use than most plant-based sources of protein. High rates of consumption of some animal products are also associated with increased human health risks, but at the same time, the animal agriculture sector is a significant contributor to many economies, and animal production and consumption in many places is grounded in very strong cultural and social traditions. And then finally, looking forward, global demand for animal products is expected to increase dramatically in the coming decades as a function of both population growth and also increased per capita consumption as individuals grow wealthier. So in response, alternative meat products, or alt meat products as I'll refer to them throughout, are substitutes for animal meat products made using new food technologies. So plant-based meat products mimic the taste and texture of conventional animal meat and can function as a direct replacement for meat, but contain no animal products. And so the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger are two of the brands with which we're most familiar and which were first to come to market. There's a multitude and host of other products and companies that are currently coming to market. And then on the other hand, cultured meat products are produced through a process called cellular agriculture. These products are also called clean meat, cell-based meat, cultivated meat, lab-grown meat. And these are more or less molecularly identical to conventional meat, but are produced through bioprocesses from animal cells extracted from biopsies rather than by raising and killing livestock. So a lot of companies have developed cellular agriculture products at pilot stages, and as you likely know, the first cultured meat products to be sold commercially were served at a restaurant in Singapore just last month. So if cultured meat and plant-based meat products come to a scale and to a price at which they're widely available and consumed, they could have significant environmental, social, and economic implications, which present both opportunities and challenges. So first of all, alternative meat products could have a much smaller environmental footprint than many conventional animal products. And so life cycle analyses, LCAs, suggest that greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and water use could be lower than for some animal meats compared to both plant-based and cultured meat. And that overall, plant-based meat is likely to have a lower aggregate footprint than cultured meat. But some LCAs suggest that energy demands in particular could be higher for cultured meat than for animal meat. Secondly, alt meat products could substantially reduce concerns about animal welfare in the meat production process. Alt meat products could confer public and individual health benefits, particularly by reducing antibiotic use and by lessening the likelihood of foodborne illness. And then finally, and the focus of this talk today is that alternative meat products could have social and economic implications for countries and states with strong rural economies that depend on animal agriculture. So on the one hand, they could alter the livelihoods, the culture, the traditions of rural producers and communities. At the same time, some countries and states may be able to create jobs and income by harnessing new economic opportunities associated with an emerging cultured or plant-based meat sector and their associated supply chains. So these potential social and economic impacts of cultured and plant-based meat, as Waverly said, have received less attention to date in the research community. And so recognizing this research gap, we asked the question, what are the social and economic opportunities and challenges of cultured and plant-based meat for rural producers, i.e. farmers and ranchers in the US? We focus on the US because although these are potentially global transitions, we need to put some parameters on the study, and because the early plant-based meat products launched first in the US, and the US may be among the first places, although it was not the first, that cultured meat products are commercially produced and sold. But all that said, many of our findings may also apply to other geographies. So methodologically, well, this research, the data for this research were collected between April and June of last year. And so in keeping with the times we find ourselves in, a lot of the data collection involved a lot of Zoom time. And we conducted semi-structured interviews with 37 expert informants. And those interviewees included a range of expertise, including representatives of cultured meat companies, plant-based meat companies, nonprofit organizations, funding agencies, governmental agencies, the beef, soy, and pea sectors, researchers, and farmers. And those interviews were structured around a common set of questions and aimed to understand the perspectives of different stakeholders as they related to both the opportunities and the threats that plant-based and cultured meat represent to farmers in the US, including any evidence of those opportunities or risks manifesting to date. And then secondly, the pathways or mechanisms that might optimize those outcomes for farmers and ranchers. So our interviews revealed a wide range of ways in which alternative meat sectors might present opportunities or threats for rural producers in the US. And so in this next section of the talk, what I want to do is briefly describe these potential impact pathways organized around these different constituencies of people that might principally be affected by each. And so these constituencies include ranchers and farmers who currently work in the animal agriculture sector, either by raising animals or producing animal feed, but also farmers that might produce the crops needed for emerging alternative meat sectors, and also rural communities more broadly in ranching and farming regions. So in terms of opportunities, the growth of alt meat sectors could generate several opportunities for people who work in agriculture. And those opportunities could accrue to new and beginning farmers who might be attracted to agriculture by new opportunities, as well as perhaps more likely those currently working in agriculture whose products might gain additional value in these new sectors or who might diversify or transition their livelihoods. One cross-cutting observation that many interviews made is that the emergence of alt meat sectors alongside traditional animal agriculture would, broadly speaking, and all else being equal, offer more choices for rural producers in terms of which markets they sell to and what forms of production they adopt or pursue. So in terms of plant-based meat, and in terms of opportunities for crop growing farmers, growth in this sector is likely to create additional demand for various crops as sources of plant proteins, in turn creating a suite of opportunities for farmers that currently grow those crops or who could adopt them into their rotations. Firstly, demand for traditional commodity crops, such as soy from plant-based meat companies, may create market opportunities for some farmers. So for example, since soy is the main plant protein in Impossible Foods products, soy farmers, or at least some soy farmers, now have the opportunity to sell to plant-based meat companies as well as to traditional commodity markets. And then secondly, perhaps more significantly, as the sector expands, there are likely to be opportunities for a greater diversity of specialist and higher value plant protein crops, such as peas, lentils, mung beans, and other legumes. So some interviewees noted, for example, that the pea protein demand in the US has increased in recent years, in part in response to demand from Beyond Meat, which uses pea protein as its main plant ingredient. And in particular, the growth in demand for US grown, domestically sourced soy, pea, lentils, and other legumes for plant-based meat could result from a greater emphasis on and a greater preference for domestic sourcing and traceability. So currently, a majority of plant proteins are sourced from outside the US, and there's less traceability of crops, but growing demand among companies and their consumers for domestically sourced inputs could expand opportunities for US growers. And so several economic opportunities may exist for such farmers who are willing and able to adapt their production and to sell to some of these emerging supply chains. Some of these crops could be outright more profitable. Production could also offer a chance for farmers to diversify their income sources, offering greater resilience. And because many leguminous crops can be incorporated into rotations with double cropping, they could actually present an additional rather than alternative source of income. And then finally, of course, environmentally, adoption of plant protein crops could bring environmental as well as economic benefits. And so leguminous crops in particular can enhance soil health, reduce the need for fertilizer application, stabilize soils, increase water capacity and infiltration, and reduce runoff. In terms of cultured meat, so the demand for crops as an input for the cultured meat sector is much less certain. In part, that's because, or in large part, that's because cultured meat is currently being produced principally at the sort of research and development scale. So, if and when cultured meat scales up, it will need some source of inputs to produce cell culture medium, growth factors, and scaffolding. But at least among our interviewees, there was significant divergence of opinion about the likely source of those products. So some interviewees considered it likely that the traditional agricultural crops would be the source of those inputs. And so if those crops are demanded, that might create additional market opportunities for crop growing farmers. So just one clear example, a company in Europe is using barley as a key ingredient for producing growth factors for cultured meat production. And soy has been demonstrated as a viable basis for scaffolding. But in contrast, some interviewees thought it much more likely that non-traditional crop sources such as algae, fungi, seaweed, yeast and fermentation processes would be more important for cultured meat. So those alternatives could still offer opportunities for some rural producers, but some of those alternatives at least may not be optimally produced on the same land as traditional agricultural crops, and the transition for a crop farmer to produce some of those alternatives may not be straightforward. So in terms of ranchers and livestock farmers, so cultured meat production requires a small number of cells that are originally sourced from a living animal. As such, cultured meat offers at least some opportunity for livestock producers who might maintain a small herd of animals as a source of cells. And of particular interest might be heritage breeds or other high value animals, including those that are sort of geographically specific. And those herds might be maintained in perpetuity, since at least one model of cellular agriculture would demand frequent input of new animal cells. And again, one concrete example of this is that of the company Eat Just, collaborating with cattle ranchers in Japan to provide cells from specialty Wagyu cows. But of course, it's likely that only a tiny fraction of all livestock producers would benefit from that business model, since the amount of cultured meat that can be produced from one cow is likely to be much greater than the amount of animal meat that can be produced from the same cow. A second opportunity here is the idea of having bioreactors for cultured meat on farms. Many interviewees discussed the possibility of a highly distributed production system of cultured meat that may be possible, at least in principle, because the bioreactor technology needed to produce cultured meat can be developed at a range of sizes and can be located anywhere. So that flexibility in terms of scale and in terms of geography could lend itself to a model of more localized production, including on farms themselves. So the analog often brought up here is that of craft breweries or of dairy farms that produce their own yogurt. And such a model would therefore enable small batch production of cultured meats on individual farms. And that would fit with consumer trends for small and demand for small, local, micro-customized kind of niche products. But some interviewees, on the other hand, were skeptical of that type of hyper-localized model. And raised concerns about affordability and cost effectiveness of small bioreactors, about the investment that would require from farmers, and the skills required to operate the technology. And so other interviewees thought that cultured meat would be more likely to be relatively centralized and perhaps close to more densely populated areas. But it's conceivable, at least, that farm scale production entrepreneurship could exist alongside industrial scale production. And again, just to cite the brewery analogy, the largest breweries are centralized, but craft breweries are also successful at the same time. Some interviewees talked about transitions into new sectors, and alt meat sectors could offer opportunities for animal farmers to diversify or to transition completely into the production of plants or algae or mycoprotein or other alternative protein products. So such a diversification or transition that could include repurposing some of their land or some of their existing infrastructure. So some examples of this include former dairy farmers in the US and elsewhere, including those who have worked with Oatly, the oat drink company, who have transitioned into oat production. Second example is former chicken farmers, including those who have worked with the Mercy for Animals Transformation Project, who have converted poultry sheds as part of a transition into mushroom production, all at small scale so far. Higher animal welfare farming was one additional opportunity mentioned. So even in a future scenario in which alternative meat accounted for a large proportion of protein demand and thus replaced some or perhaps even most animal meat from large-scale animal agriculture, most interviewees that we spoke to believed that there would remain a role for some forms of animal agriculture. And in particular, many interviewees pointed to the possibility that lower intensity, relatively high animal welfare animal agriculture could actually flourish under such a scenario. So more traditional forms of animal agriculture offer something of a different value proposition than alternative meat and could differentiate themselves in value chains around being pasture-based and organic or regenerative. So producers operating such farms might actually benefit from these greater distinctions between their products and those of alt meat products relative to the distinctions between and their current competition with large-scale animal agriculture. And then finally, a final opportunity here is two ways in which alternative meat production might be relatively compatible with current livestock farming. So first of all, there's already a market for hybrid or blended products that combine plant-based meat and animal meat. So for example, products produced by the Better Meat Company. So if cultured meat can, and then secondarily, then if cultured meat can eventually be produced at lower cost than conventional meat, it could also be used in blended products that are still primarily comprised of animal meat. That could reduce the price of the product, could maintain the competitiveness of animal agriculture, and could enable animal farmers to access new markets or to create products with a lower environmental footprint. And then finally, in terms of rural communities, both alternative meat production facilities could create new employment opportunities in rural areas. So one possible model is for a plant-based or cultured meat sector at scale, which could involve relatively large production facilities, and those could in principle be situated in traditionally agricultural states. So for example, Maple Leaf recently constructed a new facility in Indiana, and Beyond Meat's US production is in Missouri. Similarly, bioreactors could be in rural areas rather than in cities. Both forms of alternative meat production are somewhat geographically flexible. But in both cases, locating facilities in rural communities could situate them closer to input crops, thus reducing transportation costs, at least at that stage in the supply chain. Any such plant-based or cultured meat facility in a rural area could create numerous jobs, although it seems like plant-based meat facilities tend to be more automated and therefore create fewer jobs than animal meat processing facilities. If jobs in alternative meat production facilities are available as an alternative to jobs in animal meat production facilities, then that could represent an improvement for those laborers to the extent that jobs in slaughterhouses are often viewed as among the most difficult, dangerous of labor roles, including low pay, exploitation, and higher risk. And then a related opportunity to that is to repurpose existing infrastructure. And so, for example, the company Rebellious Foods has converted animal meat processing facilities into plant-based meat processing facilities. And since the two types of food processing are somewhat similar in function, the scale of operations and the types of jobs are at least somewhat similar. And then a final opportunity that was identified was that the amount of land required to cultivate ingredients for plant-based and cultured meat is projected to be considerably less than the amount of land required for animal agriculture. So again, all else being equal, if alternative meat displaced some significant proportion of animal agriculture, that could release significant areas of rangeland, pasture, or arable cropland from food production. And so in such a scenario, one potential revenue stream for landowners could be some form of payments for environmental services, such as carbon sequestration or biodiversity conservation generated by habitat restoration. So that's at least some of the opportunities that identified. There's a couple more that will be in the paper that I'm sort of relatively minor that I'm not mentioning here. In terms of threats, a couple of sort of overview comments. The degree to which alternative meat represents a direct risk to farmers, ranchers, and livestock producers depends not only on whether alt meat technologies scale up, but also on whether they actually scale to such a degree that they reduce animal meat production from its current level. And our interviewees held differing opinions on that point. So most interviewees we spoke to believed that it was extremely unlikely that there would be a complete transition from animal meat consumption to alt meat consumption in the near future. And many interviewees also believed that alt meat would principally meet a growing demand for protein and would therefore not dramatically reduce current demand for animal meat in the near future. You might therefore conclude that the fear that farmers and ranchers within traditional animal agriculture would necessarily suffer economic and livelihood loss may not be well founded. In any case, many interviewees noted that any transition, were it to occur, would likely be gradual over a course of decades rather than abrupt. As such, farmers, other incumbent actors would have time to adjust, to adapt, to transition as appropriate. And so some interviewees also pointed to past transitions in food systems, including the growth of aquaculture as a source of fish, and the trend towards chicken as a preferred animal meat in the US, as sources of lessons about the rate, the type, the impacts of any such changes. And so again, a number of possible risks and threats were identified that, similarly to the opportunities, related, broadly speaking, to crop growing farmers, to ranchers, and to rural communities more broadly. So I'll talk about each of those in a second, but first we want to outline two more kind of cross-cutting or generic risks that were identified. First, that was a concern raised by several interviewees who themselves were not directly involved in the alt meat sectors. And it was a concern that some of the expectation, or perhaps much of the expectation and optimism from those who do advocate for or who are working on developing alternative meat products could prove to be overblown or somewhat unfounded. And so that is, they didn't share any certainty that alternative meat would scale up and account for any significant proportion of meat consumption. That scenario presents a risk for farmers if they make investments or if they commit to transitions in anticipation of a scaled up alternative meat sector that don't subsequently materialize. And then secondly, on the other hand, some interviewees thought that there was a significant risk in a scenario where alternative meat production did scale up, but where a few large companies might capture the majority of the benefit. And so they were concerned about risks to individual farmers if a few producers monopolize those sectors. And so that could occur feasibly if the technologies involved, such as bioreactors, developed in such a way that they were unaffordable or inaccessible to farmers, or if there were other economies of scale involved. So as such, those interviewees thought that while farmers could benefit from the emergence of those sectors, there's no guarantee that a new system would be any fairer, more equitable, or beneficial to individual farmers. So then diving into the specific threats that were raised, many of those mentioned in relation to crop growing farmers, related to barriers to transitioning into alternative crops. So many commodity crop growing farmers in particular are relatively locked in to production for the animal feed sector. And so a lot of their physical, human, social, financial capital may be tied to corn and soy production in ways that could make it very difficult to transition into alternatives, or would make transitions rather costly. So for example, to adopt alternative plant protein crop rotations might require different tillage, different harvesting equipment. It might be more difficult to secure crop insurance or to persuade banks and lenders to award credit for new crops that might be considered riskier. And then factors beyond the farm gate also could present barriers, including a lack of reliable, well-established markets to sell into, or an absence of infrastructure that supports those supply chains. In terms of ranchers and livestock farmers, fewer risks were identified by interviewees for cattle ranchers. In particular, interviewees were relatively unconcerned about risks for cow-calf ranchers. A majority of calves in the US come from very small operations of less than 200 head of cattle, and their owners usually have other sources of income. So even if that sector were to decline, many such ranchers are not solely or even principally financially dependent on that income. In contrast, a small number of ranchers account for a majority of cattle feeding and fattening operations. And so these larger cattle ranchers would be more affected by any decline in the sector. Although, as we note earlier, many interviewees didn't believe that the animal meat sector was particularly threatened by the alt meat sector in the near future. And even if it were to be, it's possible that the competition might be primarily with chicken and with pig meat rather than with cattle. And so the risks the greatest risks were considered to be those for individuals, farmers raising chickens and pigs, many of whom are locked into consolidated, vertically integrated systems, often by virtue of somewhat unfavorable contracts. And so our interviews noted that many of the large corporations such as Cargill and Tyson that contract with those farmers have themselves invested in alternative meat and could relatively easily shift their business model if they wanted to. But there were fewer obvious opportunities or alternatives for contract farmers themselves. And that situation may be compounded by the fact that many are in debt. And so their land additionally may not be viable for alternative forms of food production. So while there are cases, as I mentioned earlier, where former chicken farmers have repurposed their sheds, those transitions have not happened at large scale, and there was broad concern that a shift away from these forms of meat production for any reason could leave contract farmers behind without viable alternatives. And then finally, in terms of threats for rural communities, so while we talked earlier about a potential localized model of alt meat production being one possibility, another plausible pathway is that bioreactor facilities could be located in or near urban areas. So companies might be motivated to situate facilities in proximity to urban areas to reduce transportation costs of their products, or in Rust Belt cities to stimulate job creation and economic opportunity. It might also just be impractical to establish alt meat production facilities in very rural communities if there's an absence of networks or infrastructure. And so at least in principle, the process of meat production could be somewhat decoupled from a dependence on rural areas and rural communities, which could deprive those communities of opportunities to benefit from these new sectors. So then a final set of questions for our interviewees were about the potential roles for actors outside of the private sector that could help to maximize the benefits and minimize the threats that they had collectively identified and which I've just discussed. So I'll discuss these very briefly and just identify roles that could be played by universities and research organizations, by government agencies, and by nonprofit organizations. So in terms of universities and research organizations, there's lots of opportunities to contribute knowledge and understanding in ways that might optimize these outcomes. So first of all, if the alt meat sector will indeed bring opportunities, then research that accelerates the rate at which those products reach the market and scale up could be beneficial. So that includes open source technology, publicly available data to meet the many multiple common needs across the cultured meat industry. For example, including the need for effective scaffolds, cell culture media, and then at a sort of more system-wide scale, a need for basic crop science and development of new variants optimized for alternative meat products. And then secondly, a number of interviewees called for research on the impact of transitions. So there's been little systematic understanding of the pathways that could support a just transition for farmers from a protein system oriented around animal agriculture to one where plant-based or cultured meat plays a larger role. So rigorous social science and systems thinking, including models that analyze the economic costs and benefits of alternative meat for farmers in the US, could help to identify and to quantify opportunities for rural America. In terms of governments, lots of different government agencies could play a role in facilitating, catalyzing transitions to a world in which alternative meat plays a role in meeting protein demand. So regulatory clarity could help to provide a clear path to market. Governments could incentivize land transitions, for example, by providing tax credits for rewilding. Public funding could be used to help support the type of research I've just mentioned, and particularly including open source technologies that might be more costly and slower to develop privately. Governments could remove, reduce, or reallocate or reform subsidies and support for animal agriculture to create a more level playing field for alternative meat companies. Governments could create or support policies and programs that support just transitions for farmers and rural communities. That might include debt forgiveness or retraining opportunities. And governments could promote job creation and economic benefits by incentivizing companies to establish production facilities in historically marginalized or disadvantaged communities. And then finally, in terms of nonprofit organizations, their roles here could include in communication and in dialogue, and such dialogue in particular could be important to enable and to ensure that farmers and ranchers have an opportunity to thrive both in the animal meat and the alternative meat sectors. Nonprofits could also facilitate rural transitions through retraining and subsidizing transition costs. And so transition programs in particular can be an imperative in supporting farmers in gap periods as they move this shift between production models. And then finally, some nonprofit organizations have demonstrated utility in advocating for an even playing field across the sector as regards to policy, to regulation, labeling, research funding, and obviously the Good Food Institute is one prominent example of that role. So to start concluding here, so our research identifies and maps out different ways in which a scaled up cultured meat or plant-based meat sector could affect outcomes among different stakeholders in rural parts of the US. And broadly speaking, our interviews revealed that if alt meat scales up, it could create a wide range of opportunities as well as threats and challenges. Most of our interviewees did not imagine a near-term scenario in which alt meat completely replaces animal meat. Even those that envisioned rapid growth in an adoption of alternative meat thought it likely that it would form an additional form of protein that captured some or perhaps all of the anticipated growing demand for protein rather than one that displaced animal meat entirely. So as such, the markets and opportunities identified could be additional rather than displacing current ones. And our interviewees identified a range of roles for universities, government agencies, and nonprofits that could help to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs from these emerging sectors. And then finally, a couple of notes on our research and prior research and what may follow. As you will notice, many of the responses to our questions were necessarily largely speculative. And so absolutely no doubt, some of the opportunities and threats identified by our interviewees here and that we report in our paper are more plausible than others. And even among our interviewees, there were very notable differences between individuals and their perception of the likelihood that alt meat products could have significant impacts on the lives of rural people in the US. So cautious skepticism may well turn out to be well-founded. But there's also a case to be made, I think, for thinking through these potential impact pathways and the possible consequences for rural producers, particularly since little research has been conducted on these questions. So we think that by reaching out to thoughtful, informed experts, that we've gathered informed insights about conceivable impact pathways from those people that have spent the most time thinking deeply about these issues. That said, we didn't ask our interviewees, nor do we make any claim here or in our paper about the likelihood, the timeline, or the magnitude of any of those potential impacts. Nor do we take any position here on whether any of these impact pathways would be more or less desirable than others. Different stakeholders may hold preferences for different outcomes. In terms of prior research, relatively speaking, relatively little research has addressed the more system-wide socioeconomic dimensions of alternative meat. More research has focused on the technological breakthroughs and on anticipated consumer acceptance or rejection and attitudes towards alternative meat. And that's understandable given the nascent nature of these technologies and the limited degree to which even plant-based meat is scaled up to date. Yet there is a need for systems-wide analyses for alternative meat, including to anticipate unintended and perhaps yet unforeseen consequences. And some of the issues raised that I've raised here have received attention from researchers. And I encourage you to read the research done by people like Garrett Broad, Neil Stevens, who I promise I did not know was going to join this call, but good to see you, Neil, and Cor van der Wiel. And then finally, in terms of future research, many of the impact pathways that we identified have not yet been well explored. And so there's an opportunity for lots of research to fill these research gaps, and that calls for both natural and social scientists to turn their attention to those. So first, to the extent that likelihood, time frame, or magnitude can be quantified, those refinements might well help decision makers and to understand the possible impacts of these sectors and to strategically target or prioritize any response. Secondly, it may be useful to map those opportunities and challenges to generate a better understanding of the spatial heterogeneity and distribution of those impacts. Third, we focused on the US, but it certainly may be useful to understand the degree to which these same opportunities or challenges could vary between countries or could be similar. And finally, of course, if these sectors do scale up, it would be useful and interesting to measure and to monitor those impacts. So that's about it. I just wanted to flag that our paper this research has been accepted for publication in the Journal for Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. It should be published within a few days, I believe. And in terms of funding, I wanted to thank the Breakthrough Institute for a research fellowship that supported this research, and also the Environmental Studies program here at CU Boulder. And so with that, I will close and very much welcome any questions or comments you may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great to hear all your insights from that research. As I mentioned, we'll be diving into the Q&A. And so how we were thinking about doing that is using the raise hand feature, which you'll see under the bottom under Reacts. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll just kind of mediate calling on people. And if you have bad connection or don't feel comfortable raising your hand and asking your question yourself, just stick it in the chat and we'll get to it if we have time. All right, Varsha has the first question.
Yeah, thank you for this talk, Pete. I really appreciate it, just how wonderfully you went through it, and it was really accessible. And so I just want to thank you for helping us understand this. So I guess I have two questions. So one is, could you help us understand kind of the general context of other threats that are affecting farmers and ranchers? I mean, I think a lot of the players in this industry are extremely motivated by the climate impacts that it could have. And so I'm curious if you have any lines of questioning with farmers of how they think about that affecting them. And then the second question, which is kind of different, is you've laid out all these opportunities, which I think are really important. And I was curious of how you think the alt protein field is kind of approaching this. This is something that the farmers are identifying for themselves, but do you think that alt protein players are also kind of focused on bringing farmers along in this transition?
Thanks, Basha. Great questions. Yeah, so on the first one, so we didn't explicitly ask about other threats to farmers and ranchers, but as you can imagine, some of those came up organically in conversation with at least some interviewees. And we do talk about a couple in the paper. I didn't mention them here. It's sort of slightly peripheral to the main thread, but I think the two that came up so commonly that we talk about them in the paper were one about the sort of, I guess, what's commonly called the aging out of farmers in the US. And so there's sort of this demographic trend and shift that the age of the average farmer in the US is increasing, and not necessarily being with sort of replacement from younger farmers, or and particularly on farms, I guess, that have been sort of traditionally generational. So that's sort of, I think, one overlying or underlying as perhaps threat or challenge that a lot of the agriculture community sector is thinking about in the US, quite independently of alternative proteins, and indeed, may have a larger or more significant impact or risk than anything that the alternative protein industry is likely to generate. So that was one, and the second one was sort of it's more specific to animal agriculture, I think, is one about consolidation, and particularly, I guess, you see this with dairy farms, a lot of small, in mainstream media headlines about how many smaller dairy farms have gone out of business or been bought up and consolidated into larger dairy companies. So how much of that is attributable to the emergence of plant-based milks and the sort of slight hold that plant-based milks have got on the milk sector versus trends that, again, would be divorced from and separated to alternative proteins or alternative milk in this case? I'm not sure. I haven't seen a good analysis of that, and they may be hard to tease apart. But your question broadly, I think, is an important one, that there are obviously other dynamics happening that may be just as influential or more influential in affecting the future of farmers' livelihoods. So that was one, and then obviously climate change is another, although it didn't come up quite as much in this context. And then you asked about whether the alt protein sector, broadly speaking, is focused on these questions. To some degree, I guess, but not as much. I mean, I think there's good reasons for that, not least of which is sort of the nascent nature of the industries, and you know, if there's a lot of focus is on the technology itself. If there's no technology, there's no sort of systemic impacts to be concerned about or to think about. But some researchers are, including Neil and others, who I mentioned, some of whom I mentioned in this on my slides, who are thinking more system-wide. But then I would say, I guess, that a lot of 90% of the interviewees I spoke to, I guess, particularly from the alt protein field itself, said, "Oh my goodness, great that you're doing this. Like this is really a question that we sort of think about in the back of our mind, but it's not something that we dedicate ourselves to or have someone thinking about. And you know, we really want to kind of understand these sort of potential pathways." So again, so while a lot of it is speculative, I got a strong sense that people were interested in trying to think some of this out. So that's one focus. I do know there's a group at CU, what's the University of California, Santa Barbara as well, who's looking at these types of things as regards fishing and alternative fish and seafood. So that's another one I didn't mention, but yeah. I think Alyssa had a hand up first, and then Ben.
Yeah, Alyssa.
My question is, I guess I'm thinking, drawing from some parallels from other meat and dairy alternatives in terms of how the media portrays things. I was wondering what kind of challenges and the kind of backlash we might see from the media. For example, I know when like the Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger, and like nut milks have come out, the media and animal agriculture, they have like a really strong hand in swaying public opinion. So I was wondering what kind of, or even like, I know there's been like lawsuits that have come out where they say like, you can't call plant-based butter butter, or like almond milk milk. So I was wondering what kind of challenges, or if you foresee the media portraying cultured meat in any kind of negative way, kind of similar to the way they've done with other animal product alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question, or questions, actually. I think the media narrative and the media portrayal is a little bit separate to the labeling law issues. Some of those have been brought by private sector groups to try to protect their own interests, or to create clarity about how products are labeled. So I do think it's important questions. They're not my expertise at all, and so I don't want to kind of overstep what I'm comfortable talking about here, other than to say that it seems like certainly that the media has a role in shaping narratives. And I think even going into this, I think I expected a little bit more to find, I guess, a little bit more antagonism between the two. And as I say, at least, I mean, again, you know, the positions, the views I present here, and the views of our interviewees, as you can see from our interviewee list, there's a lot of people who were in the alternative protein sector, and so, you know, it seems likely that their positionality may make them more optimistic, or perhaps less likely to sort of confront or address negative impacts of those sectors. But nonetheless, I think that the sort of polarization that the media sometimes creates may be overblown in this case, and perhaps isn't helpful to understanding what the actual nuances of the opportunities that may be created here. Perhaps, but again, it's not my field of expertise, and I would love to see research on that. And if anybody knows of this, I'm sure there's lots of people more informed on this than me on this call. So if you want to jump in, then feel free. Yeah, Benjamin.
Hi, Pete. Really nice talk. So you've actually just touched on my question here, answering the last one. So you've done a really nice job kind of being an unbiased observer and getting kind of as much objective information as you can from these interviews. And I was actually wondering if you would be comfortable commenting on kind of more tonally what the content of your discussions were. Was there a lot of sort of anxiety on the part of farmers, you know, when discussing this, or even hostility, or was there more kind of, you know, curiosity? I'm really kind of curious about that. And I understand if that's not something you would like to get into, but I'm just very curious as to how those sorts of conversations played out in a more personal level.
Yeah, well, actually, that reminds me of one clarification I wanted to make, I think, to Alyssa's question, or maybe Bosch's. We spoke to very few farmers. I think it was 2 or 3 of our interviewees were farmers themselves. And, you know, in some senses, that's a shortcoming of our research here. In other senses, it was, you know, it was partly a sort of snowball effect, and it was partly those people that were recommended to us as people that had spent a lot of time thinking about this. And so they're obviously farmers who are already selling to or involved in supply chains, but there are others to whom probably, you know, these opportunities and or risks have not crossed their doorstep yet. I do think one sort of important extension of this research or next step would be, particularly as these sectors start to get a little bit more traction, would be to talk to more directly to more farmers and ranchers about theirs. So we did speak to people who would represent or have a deep inside knowledge of what farmers and ranchers were thinking, sort of in aggregate and collectively, and would sort of therefore be reporting that position. But I can't say that. But we didn't speak to many farmers directly, and I don't feel comfortable sort of reporting ad hoc here on sort of more than that in terms of what people were saying or thinking.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, looks like we have 2 quick questions in the chat. One is about the role of subsidies in propping up the meat industry and how they're affecting market share and competition against alternative meat. And then similarly, there's a question referencing what might be learned by the growth of the alternative dairy market and how that has impacted the dairy industry. That could be like a leading set of indicators for alternative meat.
Great questions. I mean, again, I'm not sure I can do justice to speaking about the complex role of subsidies in the current animal agriculture industry, except I suppose to say that they're commonly cited as helping to make animal meat cheaper than it otherwise would be, or perhaps therefore should be, and that's sort of one lever that a lot of interviewees identified as being a way of kind of evening the playing field in that way. I can probably follow up maybe and probably find you something that other people have done that would help to explain that with greater authority than I can here. And then to Michael's question, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's lessons to be learned. I'm sure there's also differences in the sort of the structure of the dairy industry versus the meat industry, and therefore how these things may roll out. I haven't seen a good analysis of that, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to dive deeper into. I'm sorry, I realized some of these are kind of non-answers, but I'd rather do that than overstep.
No, I think it's great. I think everyone's getting inspired with new questions having seen this.
Yeah.
So.
Well, these are all good next steps or additional questions, right? So to the extent that there are research students on here or people who might be interested in asking research questions, then here are some of them.
Awesome. And it looks like we have just a couple more minutes. Julian, did you have a question?
Sure. Thank you. Peter, this was a fantastic talk, and I'm very happy that you gave it because I think it's something that isn't really talked about nearly enough in the field of cell ag overall. But I was wondering if you have any expectations of when we could see government intervention specifically on helping farmers transition to a new kind of cell ag or protein economy, and whether we could see that during the Biden administration or maybe in following administrations.
Yeah, well, I think there needs to be something to transition into, and I'm not sure that certainly in terms of cell ag, I don't think that's there yet, at least as far as I can tell. I mean, maybe on a very niche scale, and there certainly are some farmers who have found a niche in developing technology or ideas around cellular ag, but pretty much on the individual level, and I'm not sure it's at a scale that warrants or that would warrant or justify federal intervention or sort of transition policy at this point. In plant-based, probably closer to that mark, I guess, but again, I'm not sure I can speculate on timeline with that. There may be people that track the sector more closely here who have a sense of that, but I mean, the sort of projections for how quickly these sectors may scale up vary pretty wildly, I think. But I guess part of our motivation in doing this research now is to sort of suggest that it's never too early to start thinking about it, right? And to start, one of the hopes is that this, although some of these pathways are will likely never come to fruition. Maybe some of them will. That at least, it's better to be proactive and sort of plan and think ahead, and that might minimize harm or suffering and maximize opportunities and benefits, much more so than being reactive when something happens and it's sort of too late to help steer. And so I think there are probably opportunities to choose between these different pathways, actually, depending on the sorts of policies or sorts of interventions that are chosen or that are supported. Thanks, Julian. Great question.
Awesome.